All right, welcome to the show, everybody. We got a serious show today. So I'm going to give you a full breakdown of what's happening with the Israel-Palestine war right now. Of course, as you all know, Netanyahu made it official and said, we're at war. We're at war. And of course, this is after a Hamas invasion of Israel. Like I said, we'll break it down from every angle imaginable. We'll be as objective and fair as possible. We're also going to do what many other shows I don't think will do, which is give you what's happening now and also give you quite a bit of backstory as to how we got here, because everything in context is always better. More information is always better. So we'll do that. We also have Republican rhetoric on this issue turns genocidal. I mean, I know that sounds hyperbolic, but when you see the commentary, you'll realize it's not hyperbolic even a little bit. We have Nikki Haley on that front, and there's some writer for, I believe, the Daily Caller who, I mean, really disturbing stuff. We also have, to my surprise, Fox News fact-checked a Republican claim on this, which is spreading like wildfire. The idea that somehow Joe Biden is responsible for this Hamas terror attack, and they're using a completely misleading point in order to make the argument. And to Fox's credit, they come out there and say this is not even remotely true. So we'll talk about that. Then we have Democrats and Republicans call for war with Iran. This is why I'm saying it's a serious show. Like, the rhetoric has ramped up colossally ever since the Hamas invasion of Israel. And then we have Fox hosts calling for civil war. And I will get into the Hillary Clinton formal deprogramming comment about MAGA supporters. And very, very strange segment, throwing a little curveball at you here. I've been one of the toughest people on Matt Gaetz to this point. I think he's a purity tester and a virtue signaler, and I think on substance, him and McCarthy actually agree on stuff. The difference is Gaetz has no idea how Washington actually works, and he just wants the cameras on him. But am I not the fairest person on the planet? I'm going to give Gaetz credit for something. He actually got something right, and this is actually something that's super important, so you're going to want to hang on for that. All right, so without further ado, before we get started, everybody do me a big favor. Please click like, click subscribe. We're trying to continue to grow the channel, and with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it. So, as you all know, Hamas did an invasion of Israel recently. We did a video, Crystal and I did a video in the car driving to New York where we talked about it. I didn't have time to sit down and do a proper segment, but now you're going to get a proper segment with all the updates and everything surrounding this. So as of right now, and actually that's not fair, this is really as of last night, here are the numbers. 700 killed in Israel, 2,200 injured, 413 killed in Gaza, 2,300 injured. So that's a total of 1,113 people killed and 4,500 injured. Now I'm going to tell you up front here, I expect these numbers to shoot up massively, especially on the Palestinian side. So this is another huge piece of news here. The defense minister of Israel said the following, quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly." Now, needless to say, this is a disturbing comment. Look, I have no problem with you if you want to say that a Hamas terrorist who killed a citizen is, or civilians, I should say, women, children, etc. If you want to call them animals, hey man, fair enough, right? But there are 2 million people who live in Gaza, and they are not all Hamas. In fact, about half of them are children. And so to do a full medieval-style siege of Gaza and basically call them human animals, I mean, again, more on this later, but the rhetoric is getting flat-out genocidal. Wait until we get to what Nikki Haley said and what a Daily Caller writer said. But, okay, so how do we get to this point? Now, I should also say, there's, according to reports, there's about 100,000 Israeli troops who are ready to basically do a ground invasion of Gaza. And understand something, as of the recording of this segment, things are definitely subject to change. So, like, when this is recorded versus when this is uploaded, there's going to be a couple hours of a gap there. And, like, by the time this actually hits YouTube or hits the podcast circuit, the facts on the ground may have changed and may have gotten even more extreme and more severe, and more people may be dying, and the ground invasion could already be underway. So, all right, now let's get to the facts around this particular incident, and then we'll broaden it out to what led up to this incident, and then just the history of the region in general and how we got to this point. So this is in Axios. They say, death toll rises in Israel and Gaza as fighting rages. What to know? Hamas stunned the world when it launched a surprise air, land, and sea attack against cities across Israel in the most serious incursion against the country in decades. The Israeli military retaliated with heavy bombardment against the besieged Gaza Strip. At least 700 Israelis and 560 Palestinians have died. So this is their number as of an hour ago, I should say. Excuse me. And tens of thousands of others have been displaced in fighting that comes after a year of escalating violence in Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank. 9 Americans were killed in the Hamas attack, the State Department said on Monday. So we just learned that fact as well. At least 9 Americans are killed, and there are many people, many hostages here as well. Israeli officials said U.S. citizens were among the people militants took to Gaza and were holding hostage. The U.S. said it was working to verify those reports. So they continue here and say, they point out the Israeli defense minister, that quote I just gave you, we're going to do a complete siege, no electricity, no food, no fuel, and they called them human animals. The Israeli military said on Monday that control has been achieved in all the communities near the Gaza border, but warned there may still be Hamas militants in the area. So let me pause to point out, it took Israel a while to actually, just secure Israel from the invasion. You would think that since they're so powerful and they have so much weaponry and they're so much more organized, that, they'd be able to handle that very quickly. Well, one of the things we learned is that a lot of the settlers, a lot of the IDF forces who normally are basically on the border of Gaza and Israel, they were actually moved to the West Bank to protect settlers there. And so that gave the opportunity for there to be a Hamas invasion through the Gaza border into Israel. And so yet again, in a roundabout way here, the settlers are causing colossal problems for Israel. So they say Palestinian militants also fired heavy barrages of rockets towards Israeli cities. The UN Humanitarian Office said on Monday that more than 123,000 Palestinians have been displaced after Israeli airstrikes targeted houses and apartment buildings in Gaza. So look, this happens after, or I should say, during every single Israeli offensive into Gaza is, they say, hey, if you're a civilian, get out of the way. But then, of course, the response is, well, where are they going to go? Basically, Gaza has 2 million people in it, and it's an open-air prison. It's the size of Washington, D.C., and, where are they supposed to go? Well, people are trying to find some sort of shelter, but, with indiscriminate bombing, it's hard to guarantee your safety. They say over 70,000 people have sought shelter in dozens of schools in densely populated Gaza, where movement is highly restricted, per the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Our school sheltering displaced families was directly hit, the UNRWA said late Sunday. So this is something we saw this in 2014 as well with Operation Protective Edge. You had the Israeli military attack basically a lot of the infrastructure in Gaza, but also they did bomb schools. And of course, their common refrain after they do it is they turn around and say, well, look, we had to do it because we think that Hamas weapons were stored there, and that's why we did it. Okay, so let's continue here. They say the following: the U.S. is sending additional equipment and resources, including munitions, to Israel. It's also moving its Ford Carrier Strike Group, which includes the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, to the Eastern Mediterranean to bolster regional deterrence efforts, the Pentagon said on Sunday. So, in other words, the U.S. is going to give them more weapons, give them more artillery, and then also we're sending a bunch of our warships there. And I think one of the broader concerns is they fear Hezbollah is going to be even more involved now. Hezbollah, of course, being the militants in Lebanon who support Hamas and the Palestinians. So they fear that. There's also a lot of talk now about Iran, of course, being directly involved and helping to fund this attack. And so a big concern now is how widespread will the war become? Is it going to be Lebanon versus Israel? Is it going to be also Iran versus Israel? In that scenario, the U.S. very clearly would jump in, and it would be the U.S. and Israel versus Lebanon and Iran. But then also, does it broaden out for the rest of the allies to jump in? So will Syria join in to help their ally, Iran? Will Russia and China join in to help, Iran? And then on the U.S. side, it's like, what? Will the U.S. and, European countries jump in on the side of Israel? And, when you look at the statements from a lot of these European governments, it's like they clearly are on the side of Israel. So how widespread will this become? It's a genuinely a very, very scary moment. And we've been talking about the potential of World War III through what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. But a lot of people might not realize that this is also another way it can snowball out of control and potentially get us into World War III. It genuinely is a very, very scary moment. So they continue and say there was a heavy Israeli military presence along Israel's border with Gaza on Monday. Hezbollah and Israel exchanged fire earlier Sunday after the Lebanese militant group fired rockets into northern Israel. So, Hezbollah is involved to one extent or another at this point. They continue here. The conflict is unfolding amidst a deep political crisis in Israel over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government's judicial overhaul, which has weakened the country's military, economy, and society. So let me just pause to reflect on this here for a second. Of course, Netanyahu wanted to basically take some power away from the Supreme Court and give it more to the Knesset and himself. And this is widely unpopular in Israel. There's a lot of dissent over this question in Israel, and there were gigantic protests over this. And a point that a lot of people are making is, one of Netanyahu's main arguments for being in power is, I'm going to keep you safe and secure. But clearly, he took his eye off the ball. Likud took their eye off the ball, and they were so concerned with their judicial reforms that, this was a colossal intelligence failure in Israel for this wide scale of an invasion to unfold, and they had no idea. I mean, huge, huge failure. And again, some of the speculation is, well, you were so obsessed with your judicial reform and basically getting more power for yourself in the Knesset and weakening the Supreme Court. This is what happened. Now, also, I should point out, remember, guys, the Supreme Court in Israel, it's a little different from how it works here. Here in the U.S., as of right now, the Supreme Court is a very conservative force in American politics. In Israel, the Supreme Court is actually a moderating force. So they've really pumped the brakes on some of the more extreme, ultra-right-wing, settler colonialist stuff. They've pumped the brakes on some of the Likud stuff. So that's, and then you take power away from them, so one of the checks and balances on the extremism of the right-wingers there is now gone. So, and now with an actual hot war breaking out, are we going to be put in a position where now there's no brakes at all in the Israeli car? So there's a lot of things to be fearful of here. So Axios continues, U.S.-led negotiations were underway for a historic peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and is jeopardized by the fighting. The normalization of relations between the two countries had been a top Biden administration priority. So Saudi Arabia released a statement after the Hamas attack and basically was like, we're going to blame Israel for this. And so whatever sort of movement there was towards a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia kind of fell apart here. So they say this is how it happened. Hamas fired thousands of rockets at Israeli cities early on Saturday. Hamas militants then broke through the border barrier between Gaza and Israel. They entered southern Israel with pickup trucks and occupied Israeli villages and towns close to the border, killing soldiers and civilians while taking others hostage. Hamas took a significant number of Israelis hostage. Israeli Defense Forces International spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Kornarkus told CNN the Israeli military didn't respond to the initial attack for several hours. Now, by the way, I should point this out. Israel has a track record of doing huge prisoner exchanges where, like, if there's one IDF official who's captive in Gaza, they'll release like hundreds or even in some cases thousands of Palestinian prisoners to get the one military official. So they have a track record of doing that, and it'll be interesting to see, especially now with Americans involved as well. I'm sure they're going to be working on trying to make some sort of a deal and maybe freeing a giant number of Palestinian prisoners at the same time. And to keep it real, if it wasn't for the hostage situation, I think it's very likely that we would see some of the worst bombing we've ever seen happen in Gaza. I mean, like I said, Operation Protective Edge 2014, there were 1,300 deaths. At least 500 of them were children. Between 63% and 80% civilians were killed in Gaza. And that would be child's play compared to what might happen now and what almost definitely would happen if there weren't hostages as well. So I think there will be a line of communication open to try to make some sort of a deal to get hostages out of there. How Israel responded. Israel has retaliated with airstrikes, with Netanyahu saying the enemy will pay an unprecedented price. Hundreds of thousands of reservists have been mobilized. Netanyahu told Palestinian residents to leave areas where militants were located, saying Israel will turn all Hamas hiding places into rubble. We will operate everywhere and with all of our force. This war will take time and it will be difficult, but we will win. So what did Hamas say about the attack? So the Hamas spokesperson told Al Jazeera that the group wants, quote, the international community to stop atrocities in Gaza against Palestinian people, our holy sites like Al-Aqsa. All these things are the reason behind starting this battle, he said. More than 2 million Palestinians live in Gaza, an area roughly twice the size of Washington, D.C., which has been under a strict blockade by Israel, backed by Egypt, for 16 years. Violence in the occupied West Bank has escalated this year, including an attack on Palestinians in the village of Huwara in February. Israel's far-right government has moved to expand housing in Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which most of the international community considers illegal under international law. Violence and escalating tensions have often centered around a holy site for both Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem that is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so then they just get into what other countries have said. Of course, the U.S. came out and said we stand by Israel, as of course we were going to do. The European Commission president came out and said something. Iran, of course, jumps in on the side of Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. So we know what happened with this war breaking out and the Hamas invasion, et cetera, and we just went through all the facts on that. But the Washington Post had a phenomenal article where they lay out what happened just before this, right? So like the year leading into this attack, what went down, what was the escalation that led to the point we are now. So in the Washington Post, the title is, What's Behind the Violence in Israel and Gaza? Here's what to know. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the nation was at war Saturday after Palestinian gunmen infiltrated Israel from Gaza, launching attacks on troops and civilians in the most brazen militant operation in years. Israel responded with air and artillery strikes in Gaza, where the population was bracing for a wider campaign. They go on to bring up some of the casualty numbers. All right, let's get to... So here we go. In September, there were already growing fears of all-out conflict. They say just last month, Israel and Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that rules Gaza, appeared to be on the brink of war. Israeli border agents found explosive material hidden in a shipment of jeans and halted all exports from the Gaza Strip. Hamas put its forces on high alert and held field exercises with other armed groups, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The drills included practice rocket launches, ambushes, and the storming of settlements. Local media in Gaza reported in an apparent preview of the attacks launched on Saturday. Hamas also allowed Palestinians to begin protesting again along the separation fence between Israel and Gaza, where young demonstrators have faced off against Israeli soldiers. On September 13th, 5 Palestinians were killed when they attempted to detonate an explosive at the barrier wall. Quote, "It has been quiet, but it's beginning to boil." Bassem Naim, head of Hamas's political and international relations department, said in an interview with the Washington Post in September, there is a lot of pressure under the water. So here's, they lay out that during the summer, there were a bunch of military raids and retaliatory attacks. The tensions in Gaza followed a violent summer in the West Bank, where tit-for-tat attacks flared between Palestinian militants on one side and Israeli forces and Jewish settlers on the other. Israel staged multiple military raids in the city of Jenin, where it said militants were planning attacks on Israeli troops and civilians. On June 19th, Israeli forces raided Jenin and killed at least 5 Palestinians, deploying Apache helicopters in the West Bank for the first time since the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, which lasted from 2000 to 2005. The next day, Hamas gunmen opened fire at a hummus restaurant outside Eli, an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, killing 4 Israelis. And on June 21st, hundreds of Israeli settlers rampaged through Palestinian villages, including Termus Aya, where one person was killed, torching homes and cars, as well as shooting at residents, according to Termus Aya Mayor Lafi Adib. Israel then also carried out its first drone strike in the West Bank since 2006, killing 3 suspected militants. On July 3rd, Israel's military launched its biggest operation there in more than 2 decades, staging an air and ground attack on a refugee camp in Jenin with roughly 1,000 soldiers. Israeli officials said they were targeting a militant command center in an operation that marked the start of an extensive counterterrorism effort that the Israeli Defense Forces said would continue indefinitely. At least 8 people were killed and 80 injured, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. So when we get to spring violence flares in Gaza and the West Bank. Before Israel's massive operation in Jenin in July, its security forces shot and killed a 14-year-old boy on a bicycle as they pursued 2 Palestinian militants in March. The Post created a 3D reconstruction of the raid by synchronizing and reviewing dozens of videos from March 16th when the incident took place, as well as speaking to witnesses. In early April, during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa barricaded themselves inside the mosque. Israeli police then stormed the site in the old city of Jerusalem and used stun grenades and tear gas, fired sponge-tipped bullets, and indiscriminately beat Muslim worshippers, including elderly people and women, with batons and rifle butts, the UN Human Rights Office said in a statement. About a month later, Israel launched surprise airstrikes in Gaza, targeting leaders of the Islamic Jihad militant organization, which is backed by Iran. The strikes killed 3 top militants and 10 others, according to Palestinian health officials, including 4 women and 4 children. Israel carried out the strikes a week after it reached a ceasefire with Palestinian armed factions. The Israeli Defense Forces said the 3 senior Islamic Jihad members who were killed were responsible for recent rocket fire and attacks against Israelis. The strike set off a 5-day bout of violence that killed at least 33 people in Gaza and 2 people in Israel. Israel and Islamic Jihad agreed to a ceasefire on May 13th. Now, in January, they say an operation in Jenin and a synagogue massacre. The year started with bouts of violence, including an Israeli military operation in Jenin that resulted in a shootout that killed 9 Palestinians, local authorities there said. The raid was carried out on January 26th, and the next day, a Palestinian gunman opened fire at a synagogue in East Jerusalem, killing 7 people, including children, during prayers. At the time, Hamas official Musir al-Mashri congratulated the attacker, who was killed by Israeli security forces, saying the shooting was a quick response to the Jenin massacre and is evidence of the vitality and readiness of the resistance. So this is what we have. This is everything that happened recently. So in other words, to break this down for you, there was already tit-for-tat escalation, tit-for-tat violence that was slowly getting to a boiling point leading up to the Hamas invasion of Gaza. And then the other point, which has been reported widely, which everybody who follows geopolitics knows, is that the Israeli settlers have been more brazen, more extreme, taken more territory, and there's the routine, raising of Palestinian villages, just stealing their land from them without a second thought. And so that also breeds incredible hatred and resentment, and has helped feed the tit-for-tat back and forth. And so now you know what's happening now with the war. Now you know what led up to the war, all the individual incidents that led up to the war. But look, I'm going to do what most shows are not going to do, which is let's also go to the history of Israel and Palestine and see how we even got to this point with this war, and also the preliminary issues leading to this war. So this is a great video here, very objective, very fair, very balanced, from Vox, where they lay out for us. We're going to start at the World War II period and post, the Holocaust, where sentiment was growing that, hey man, a bunch of Jews were exterminated. They want to be safe. Maybe we should grant them a homeland. Maybe the international community should say, okay, here's a Jewish homeland. And of course, it's understandable after there was a Holocaust. Like, hey, they need to make sure they're protected, so they want their own homeland. The sentiment is very clear and understandable, but also at the same time, it was like, let's give them a homeland, and oh yeah, by the way, this place where Palestinians happen to be, it's like, we're just going to use this area and not really care what the people in the region say. So you could already see like the genesis of a long-term conflict, which is how Israel was created in the first place. So let's dive into it and we'll react to it.
In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into 2 separate states. One for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short-term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long-term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers, calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. But this violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work, and violence didn't work, that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
So this video right here was prescient, man. It really was. This video was made like 7 years ago. 7 years ago. And I think they did a great job going through the history and just giving the facts. And I think that call at the end is basically spot on. That, like, there's this position that we're in, which is unsustainable. And so, look, two things are true at the same time. And as I've been watching social media over the past few days, I've been absolutely driven crazy. Like, I'm looking at this and I'm like, has everybody lost their goddamn mind? Everybody sounds like a total psycho on this. So I see people on the left basically not condemning or saying it's bad for Hamas to massacre innocent civilians, like women and children. And the argument is like, well, you know, decolonization is going to be violent. Like, what'd you expect? Well, massacring innocent civilians is wrong as a matter of principle, no matter who does it. It's not like some 7-year-old is guilty for the sins of their parents. This should be the most obvious, basic, moral, ethical point of all time. Nobody should justify or rationalize killing civilians ever, period. Right? So I've seen a lot of that going on, which is incredibly disturbing. And then on the other side, what's incredibly disturbing to me is this insistence on the right, not only the now genocidal rhetoric coming from the right, but also this idea of like, well, this was totally unprovoked. Unprovoked. Don't act like we don't know exactly what's at the core of this wanton violence. That doesn't justify it, that doesn't excuse it, that doesn't rationalize it, especially the targeting of civilians, which is always, always, always wrong. But there's no doubt what's at the core of this. And anybody who's familiar with the history of it, if they're being honest, they'll tell you what's at the core of this. And so we know, you know, Amnesty International came out with a report a few years back, which said in no uncertain terms, there's an apartheid state happening right now. There's an apartheid state. The biggest human rights group in Israel calls what's happening apartheid. It's a total police state. Gaza is called an open-air prison. Palestinians have no political rights and no human rights. There's the Gaza situation. There's also the West Bank situation where you have all this expansion of illegal settlements time and time again and just raising Palestinian villages and setting up new settlements. In Gaza, of course, it's literally a permanent military occupation where goods don't flow freely in and out. And they control the electricity and they control every aspect of human existence. So it's like, is that what's at the core of this? Did this breed the resentment that leads to this backlash? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. So yet again, I'm reminded, I don't know if it's social media made us all insane or if everybody was already insane and now it's just showing it to the world, right? But I've seen a lot of very, very disturbing reactions to this. And so now what my fear is, apart from the fact that everybody lost their goddamn mind, is that this seems like it's going to spiral out of control completely, right? And there's zero, I mean, some of the squad members called for a ceasefire and de-escalation, and it's like they got ruthlessly and viciously dunked on, and the entire political establishment is calling for vengeance, and they're bloodthirsty, and it's like this idea of like, let's do even more militarization. let's crack down even harder on Palestinians. And it's like, so the cycle of violence, in other words, is not going to end, right? And again, what I fear is, best case scenario, what we're going to see now is what we saw with Operation Protective Edge in 2014, which is overwhelming, disproportionate military force where Israel just absolutely levels Gaza and the Palestinians. And I think worst case scenario, this breaks out into a much, much wider conflict. And Lebanon gets even more involved. Iran gets dragged in. We already have U.S. politicians calling for war with Iran. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. It's not good, man. It's not good. And it's only going to get worse. So we'll end on this note here. I want to give you guys some of the numbers in this conflict. The human cost of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is documented by the United Nations. In 2008, you had 3,202 Palestinians killed, 853 Israelis. 2009, 7,460 Palestinian kills, killed 123 Israelis. 2010, 1,659 Palestinians killed, 185 Israelis. 2011, 2,260 Palestinians killed, 136 Israelis. 2012, 4,936 Palestinians killed, 578 Israelis. 2013, 4,031 Palestinians killed, 157 Israelis. 2014, this is when we had Operation Protective Edge, which leveled Gaza. 19,860 Palestinians killed, 2,796 Israelis. 2015, 14,813 Palestinians killed, 339 Israelis. And you guys can see the rest of these numbers. We don't have to go through absolutely all of them. They're on the screen here. But look, man, the way to deal with this conflict, there's two potential ways to deal with it. I'll tell you which one I favor at the end here. But the old school idea, which has been like the dominant idea for a long time, is the two-state solution, which is like roughly divide Israel and Palestine along the 1967 borders. Palestinians get their own independent state. Israel keeps their own independent state. And have it internationally recognized and try to basically make peace from there, okay? That's one potential way. Most experts say, look, that's a fantasy now. It's just dead. Israel has no political will to recognize a free and independent Palestine, no matter what some people might say, although now they've kind of ripped the mask off and they stop even pretending like they're in favor of an independent Palestine. That appears to be dead in the water, the two-state solution. The only other solution would be a one-state solution where everybody is equal. You have democratic rights across the board. You have political rights. You have voting rights across the board. Everybody is treated equally. Everybody is treated fairly, and you stop the apartheid-like system. That's the only other solution. And unfortunately, what we're seeing instead is like a slow-motion ethnic cleansing, and now there's a massive backlash to that. And, you know, what do you do? I mean, unfortunately, the United States has not really been a broker, a neutral broker, an arbiter of peace. We've been more like, you know, massively on the side of Israel, overlooking or outright encouraging some of their worst human rights abuses. We give them money. We give them weapons on a regular basis. And so the idea that we were ever some neutral arbiter for peace is kind of laughable. But at the end of the day, look, I wish we were that neutral arbiter for peace. I wish we could get involved in a way that would sort of force the hand of Israel to come to some sort of a peace agreement and some sort of a conclusion where we can bring about Palestinian human rights and political rights. And as of right now, we've never been further from that before, ever. Because now the violent rhetoric is ramping up. There's going to be a backlash effect in the other direction. It's only going to lead to more militarization, more war. Now you have flat-out genocidal rhetoric coming out, and it's ugly, man. We're in a really, really bad spot, and I don't see any real, reasonable voices who are leading the way. And that's terrifying. So look, I tried my best here to give what I view as an objective, a fair reading of the situation, give you all the facts and the information, and you can make your own mind up. But one thing that I don't think is debatable is we're in trouble. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.